Hello and welcome to the inaugural episode of the Fix Your Gut podcast. My name is Jason Hooper and I'm here with John Brisson.
Hi, everybody. Hope you're doing well.
For our first episode, we're going to be talking about acid reflux and all of its various types. And John, the reason why I wanted to talk about acid reflux today is because according to the CDC, there's been a huge increase in the number of reported cases of acid reflux. It's gone up 47% since last year. And so according to the CDC, 17.1% of the American population has reported some sort of reflux symptoms. And doing the math, that's somewhere around 600 million Americans.
That's a lot of people that are suffering from reflux.
It is. And they also go on to say that there's a link between reflux and esophageal cancer, and that's probably why we see some of the traditional treatment methods that we do. Although I disagree with the traditional treatment methods, they do seem to have an impact on esophageal cancers. The traditional treatment method is like, oh, well, you have acid reflux, so we need to get rid of all your stomach acid, right? And so like now people, they take like proton pump inhibitors like imazaprole, or they take some kind of calcium carbonate, like Tums or whatever, and they lower their acid. And I guess that would prevent the esophageal cancer, right? Because you're not getting the damage to the esophagus.
Well, you're just getting less damage from the esophagus because it is possible that gram-negative endotoxins, some people having a dysbiotic flora in the esophagus itself, or people refluxing endotoxins from the stomach, could also inflame the esophageal tissue, along with pepsin or bile, depending on what type of reflux the person has. But I would say that if you are refluxing less acid, I would assume it would have less of an effect on the esophageal tissue.
Yeah. So you're saying that basically there's bacteria that produce toxins that leach out into your tissues, and that can be a cause for cancer as well as the acid.
Yes, or pepsin or bile or whatever a person's refluxing, and how it can damage the cells that make up our esophagus over time and cause cancer to develop.
Okay, so let's talk about pepsin or peptidase. So pepsin is a enzyme that breaks down proteins, right? But there's different forms of it. Depending on the pH, it takes on a different shape. So the protein, you think of it as like this big glob of amino acids, and it strips proteins down into peptides, like smaller proteins, basically. But it has to have a certain pH in order to do that, in order to hold that shape. So if you have low stomach acid, then it won't be in the form of pepsin, right?
No, it'll be inactivated if you're not producing enough stomach acid to lower the stomach pH, which is why with people with silent reflux, sometimes we recommend that they consume alkaline water so that the alkalinity of the water inactivates the pepsin that is left over from them refluxing, that embeds itself in the upper esophageal sphincter area and sometimes the oral cavity.
Yeah, I want to come back to that. But so we're just breaking down the different components that are produced in the stomach that can cause damage. So the stomach acid's not the only thing. The pepsin can cause damage to the tissues because it can start breaking down the tissues. Like pepsin doesn't care if it's food or if it's you, it breaks it down anyway, right?
Yes. I mean, the average person refluxes, through studies that we know, mainly stomach acid, at least 20 to 30 times a day. Through eating, laughing, bending over, and our esophageal cells are able to handle it. I mean, our GEO cells have their own mechanisms to produce bicarbonate so that it neutralizes the acid itself over time. So usually
Mm.
it doesn't cause a problem. I mean, they produce, I think it's carbonic anhydrase on basal cells or layer of the esophagus, which is like one of the most outermost layers. Uh, and that itself neutralizes any acid. The problem is if a person is refluxing acid too much, or they're refluxing these other components, whether it's pepsin, which our esophagus does not really have defense mechanisms against, or bile, which is even more caustic than the other two, or bacterial endotoxins as well. There's just not really any mechanisms in place for our esophagus to protect itself. Where acid, there are some mechanisms, and it does happen quite quickly to everyone throughout the day.
What about mucus that's coming down to the esophagus?
That would help some. Also, the bacteria Akkermansia mucophilia does colonize the esophagus, and it does help to break down and rebuild the mucus lining of our esophagus as well.
Okay, so there's some friendly bacteria that are in our throat area that help to create protective barriers against stomach acid in our healthy tissues.
Yes, Akkermansia mucophilia is a gram-positive bacteria that helps keep our esophagus mucosa in proper health.
Okay. So we have stomach acid that can trigger pepsin, and we also have bile, right?
Yes, bile reflux, which is one of the rare types of reflux. But bile is extremely caustic even to the stomach, to the esophagus, anything it comes into contact with outside of the small intestine.
So how is the bile? Because bile's usually bile's usually made by the liver. I mean, it can be excreted through other processes, but like the duodenum or the duodenum, depending upon your pronunciation, like that's where most of that stuff is made, right?
Yes, but it is, like you said, released by the liver into the gallbladder and then into the duodenum. But if there's enough pressure that a lot of people have when they're dealing with reflux, they're also dealing with dysbiosis that can create a lot of gas, either hydrogen gas or methane or hydrogen sulfide. So this bloating can propel the bile up past the pyloric sphincter to the stomach, and then from there it can be reflux into the esophagus through being pushed through the lower esophageal sphincter.
I gotcha. So basically, dysbiosis, that's where bacteria is where it's not supposed to be, I guess is the simplest way to explain that, right? You've got bacteria that are either too frequent in number or not in the right part of the gastrointestinal tract. And when that happens, they behave strangely. And usually, what they do is they produce some sort of gas because it's part of their metabolism. They eat and they excrete waste, and a lot of that waste comes in the form of hydrogen or methane or hydrogen sulfide. Like there's a bunch of different compounds.
Yes.
And that gas builds up. So dysbiosis, that's where you have either an abnormal amount of bacteria in an area of the GI tract, or you have bacteria that are in the wrong place, right? And so when that happens, they start to behave strangely. And a lot of time, that means that they have an increase in their metabolic rates. So they eat food, which is basically the same food you're eating, and they excrete waste. And that waste can be in the form of hydrogen gas, methane gas, hydrogen sulfide, a lot of different compounds. And that puts pressure on the sphincters that try to keep everything going in the right direction. The sphincters let stuff in so the things can go down, and they don't like things going backwards the other way. And so if there's enough gas building up, it can put pressure on that sphincter and send bile back up into the stomach, which then can be refluxed all the way back up into the esophagus, which is really not a good thing.
No, not at all. And like I mentioned earlier, You have some gram-positive bacteria in your esophagus, and you have like Akkermansia mucophila, which is gram-negative. You have different bacteria within your esophagus that help maintain the proper microbiome and the integrity. And when you start refluxing all these bacteria, you start getting a colonization of these bacteria, and as well as other things like bile, which could be caustic to some bacteria that aren't used to being around it. Can start causing further dysbiosis issues and further problems. I'll probably briefly talk about H. pylori, I would assume sometime later, and its ability to cause a lot of these issues. But yeah, I definitely agree with you, Jason, about your presentation of dysbiosis.
So how does that happen? Because when you go, like, let's say you're having symptoms with acid reflux, you go into the doctor and say, hey, I'm having heartburn, right? I guess that's like one of the first symptoms that you'll probably get, is that you'll feel that pressure against the lower esophageal sphincter, right?
Yes.
And so like you go and you say like, I'm having heartburn. And they say, oh, well, are you eating spicy foods? That must be it, right? Are you eating a bunch of or fatty foods, like just eat a bunch of chicken wings or what? So what do you think about that?
Well, I mean, that's what they usually do. They'll blame it on, and a person's diet does have some degree to effect on their microbiome.
Oh yeah,
and I do agree with them on that. But they'll be like, well, I guess you're eating too much fat, you're eating too much spices, or they'll give you a list of foods that could trigger reflux, which some can, and some seem like they do not. I've written a couple of blogs on Fix Your Gut about the common myths surrounding certain foods that trigger reflux and certain foods that seem to not. But that being said, yeah, they'll blame it on that, and then they'll go, well, I guess we have to reduce the acid somehow instead of not correcting the dysbiosis, which is the most cause of reflux for most people. Some people it could be postural, some people it could be because they have a hiatal hernia. But yeah, for most people, it's improper diet and dysbiosis, and probably eating too much and eating too often. Not eating during the daytimes and trying to keep a proper circadian rhythm for their meals. Being constipated, all those are different causes of it. And the doctor's not addressing all that. Instead, they're like, well, we're not going to address any of the root causes. Instead, we're going to tackle the root symptom, which is acid reflux. So here is they'll either use antacids, like you mentioned, like Tums, which is calcium carbonate, or magnesium carbonate or sodium bicarbonate, or they'll use H2 antagonists that block histamine, which is important for the production of stomach acid, like Tagamet or Pepsid. Or they'll give you a proton pump inhibitor, which really reduces the amount of acid that your stomach's able to produce through the proton pump. So pretty much completely stops acid production for the most part. And you still produce a little bit, but it's I think it's reduced as much as 90% within the stomach. So you go here, and some people start taking PPIs, and their doctor giving them for reflux, and they start feeling better, for a time, because less acid is irritating the esophagus. But most of the time, it makes a person's dysbiosis get worse, because acid serves a purpose, Jason, as you well know, in the stomach. It's there to help break down food, but it's also there to help keep a proper microbiome, because a lot of bacteria like H. pylori, they produce urease, which eventually produces ammonia, which reduces stomach acid production and increases the stomach pH. And in doing so, they can survive. Your stomach's supposed to be very acidic. The resting pH for the stomach is supposed to be 2 to 3, and when you eat, it's supposed to be 1 to 2. So a lot of people walk around with dysbiosis that have a heartburn. The resting pH for their stomach's 4 or 5. It's ridiculous. So why would you take a proton pump inhibitor to possibly make it worse, or to make someone have a more alkaline stomach? It doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, so you said a lot of good stuff there, and I kind of want to unpack some of it. And one of the things that you said is that some people, because of their posture, will experience more reflux, and it's basically just gravity, right? If like if you're upright and you're maintaining sort of like a straight line from the base of your skull all the way down to your tailbone, you're less likely to have reflux symptoms. But a lot of people have them at night when they're lying down, because they're either supine or they're prone, and you don't have gravity working in your favor. Yeah, so then gravity is not really holding everything in place, and it's a lot easier for reflux to occur.
And that's why some people seem like it's better for them to sleep on their left side because it puts pressure on the lower esophageal sphincter. They're less likely to reflux. Where people sleep on their back or their right side, they might have more reflux. If someone sleeps on their stomach, they definitely tend to have more
Yeah,
reflux because you're pushing your abdomen upwards.
right. So explain why sleeping on your left side is advantageous, like because of that asymmetry there.
Yeah, your stomach's anatomically on the left. So sleeping on the left side, it seems to move the stomach into a more proper anatomical position so that it's not sliding up like you'd see with a hernia. As well, it also seems to put pressure directly on the LES, helping it to maintain being closed.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at the diagram, I guess your stomach's kind of in sort of a moon shape,
Yes.
right? And it kind of bulges out towards, it sort of bulges out in that direction. So if you sleep on the left side, it kind of pushes everything, kind of makes it more symmetrical, I suppose. It's still not symmetrical, but it's better to sleep on the left side than the right side. And, I want to talk about seating posture too, because like, let's say you go out and you have a whole bunch of chicken wings, you have the extra spicy wings, 20 or 30 of them. And then you go home and you're like, oh man, that was good, but I'm getting the itis. And then you sit down on the lazy boy recliner and you prop your feet up, and it's right after you've eaten all this food. So your stomach is packed with food. And then your posture is so that you're not quite supine, but you're reclining backwards. And then you wonder why you're getting this heartburn, this really bad heartburn. You're like, oh, it's because I ate a bunch of spicy food. Well, yeah, I mean, you're getting that spiciness because it's, pushing up against your LES, your lower esophageal sphincter, and you're feeling that the burn of the spices again, but it's not really. I mean, if you look at how spicy foods, especially capsaicin, affect the digestive system, it's usually a net positive benefit, not a negative benefit.
Yeah. I mean, that was one of the foods, one of the things that talk about the cause of reflux. Is I'm not going to say that capsaicin and some people with damaged mucosal barriers like me would add silent reflux, and it can irritate the esophagus because that's what capsaicin is, it's an irritant. But it also reduces inflammation and also blocks the TRPV1
Yeah.
receptors. For some people without visceral hypersensitivity, it can reduce pain. But yeah, it doesn't cause reflux. I mean, that's what all this it blows my mind, Jason. I know you're talking about this, but how we have a lower esophageal sphincter. We have a sphincter that closes. When food's in our stomach, when we're not swallowing, and it's supposed to keep our stomach contents within our stomach properly. And doctors think, well, like you talk about gravity. How does reflux ever cause the LES, put pressure on the LES and cause it to open to push the stomach contents upwards? That pressure has to come from somewhere, whether it's postural or dysbiosis creating, gases. The main gases in the intestinal tract are nitrogen, carbon dioxide, which are both made by a lot of probiotic bacteria. Nitrogen goes into our bloodstream to become nitrous oxide. Carbon dioxide we breathe out. They don't really bloat. But those other gases, hydrogen, methane, and hydrogen sulfide, they bloat. Our body really doesn't have any mechanisms other than expelling them out. With hydrogen sulfide, it does a little bit with our mitochondria and through the bloodstream, but mainly hydrogen and methane, we have to either burp them out or have flatulence to dispel most of it. So when you have these gases build up that aren't supposed to be in huge quantities, it puts more pressure on our abdomen, more pressure on our sphincters, and that's what triggers reflux.
Yeah, and in a healthy digestive tract, there's going to be less gas being produced, number one. And number two, when you have proper motility, when everything's moving at the proper speed, those gases are going to dissolve back into everything. So they're not going to be just separate from the other materials. You can think about a 2-liter bottle of your favorite soda. You shake it up really hard and then it can, all the CO2 gets activated. You might see some fizz, but then if you leave the cap on, it'll dissolve back into the liquid. But if everything's constantly volatile and moving all over the place, or if the opposite's true too, I mean, it's even more true because if everything's plugged up, you're going to end up with more gas because nothing's going to end up dissolving. So motility has a huge impact on the amount of gas produced and therefore, your likelihood for reflux. Yeah, you also talked about when you were talking about the causes of acid reflux being posture. You're also kind of talking about sort of the pH and its effect on the sphincter's ability to open and close properly. And you were saying that like if your stomach pH was in the range of about 5, I think you said that sometimes your LAS has trouble closing all the way.
Yes.
Can you go more into why that is? Like, why is it that more acid helps the sphincters close? And shouldn't it be the opposite? Like if there's more acid, shouldn't they open up?
You mean to let food in? Well, it's all about timing. As soon as you eat food, it takes a little bit for that pH to drop. That resting pH between 3 to 4. An average person that's somewhat healthy for it to drop. It's not going to drop as soon as as soon as you eat food. Your stomach's not going to squeeze all the acid out of the peritoneal cells, and you die. So it takes time. So your body gives you about, I'd say, anywhere between about 30 to 45 minutes to eat a complete meal. And through that time, some of the food that you're eating is already going through the pyloric sphincter to a degree of what's digested. Liquids are to some degree. And it's just sitting in your stomach. So the stomach pH starts decreasing. It takes time for the mechanisms to produce stomach acid through the different hormones to be released, for it to actually be produced finally, to be released by the stomach. And so usually around that time, anywhere between 30 to 45 minutes, the stomach pH is usually good about 1 to 2. In a healthy person, a person taking a PPI could be 2 to 3 to maybe even 4. And so the body, looks at that and it goes, well, you're done eating. I should close the sphincter. It can release a little bit if there's gas, but that way you won't reflux your stomach contents. You won't vomit. You won't regurgitate. Yeah. And so that's usually the mechanism of closing is based. Your body is very intelligent. It knows, okay, the stomach is now acidified. I need to keep this contents in here until it's digested.
Okay. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So I guess it's the acid acts as a signaling mechanism. So when the pH lowers, right, that means there's more acid and everything starts to tighten up because we don't want that to come back up and burn our throats.
Yes, very much so.
All right. So you also talked about some mechanical reasons for why we might experience acid reflux. You're talking about a hiatal hernia. Are there other mechanical reasons why some people might be more susceptible to them because of, I don't know, just the way they're shaped?
Possibly. I mean, if you're hunched over, you have the correct proper, maybe from scoliosis, it's possible you could have more abdominal pressure. You could have a condition called Zollinger-Ellison syndrome where you have gastrin producing tumors that would, greatly acidify your stomach. And in some people with dysbiosis, that could cause really bad reflux. So, that would be another mechanical reason why a person would be getting reflux. That would be, separate somewhat from just having, dysbiosis, would be having these gastrin-producing tumors, and you see in Zollinger-Ellison syndrome.
So what's the frequency?
It's very rare. It's not common.
Yeah. So for people listening, like I know sometimes when I listen to podcasts and I hear something, it's like, oh, I've got that. I've got tumors in my stomach. Probably not. Like it's pretty rare.
It's pretty rare, yeah. I mean, if you're suffering from unrelenting GERD, that's nothing seems to be, fixing it, no matter natural or medical, anything you try isn't doing anything. And then if you're, you might want to talk to a healthcare professional about having an endoscope done. Which I rarely recommend those because of the problems associated with endoscopes, like increased risk of infection or injury to the esophagus or the stomach itself. So I'm not a person to go around, recommend them willy-nilly, or there are sedation issues or whatever. But yeah, then you might want to go, get your stomach checked out, especially if you're having really bad gastritis too as well with it. But yeah, it's not common. You are right. But those are what I would say the mechanisms, other than maybe like myself having a abdominal hernia mesh repair or abdominal hernia, that could put pressure too as well. Both of those could, but those would be more of the mechanical side of things.
What about just obesity?
But I have known a lot of people who are extremely overweight who did not have any gastric reflux at all. My brother's pretty much, he's a 400-pound Korean truck driver, and I guess all the kimchi he ate as a kid, his microbiome's pretty decent. He never gets reflux. He's got an iron stomach, so.
You're saying that the truck contained Korean products, like your brother's not Korean.
Yeah, he is.
Your brother's Korean?
Yeah, I have an adopted brother. My dad adopted him at 17.
Oh, cool. Oh, I didn't
He
know
was a
that.
friend of mine whose parents he left them. But he's a truck driver, and he goes around, and he's 400 pounds, and he ate a lot of kimchi growing up. So I guess his microbiome's pretty good
Okay.
shape from all those prebiotics and probiotics that he got from kimchi ingestion.
All right. Sorry, I was confused there for
It's
a second.
okay. It's okay.
I was like, well, you're not Korean, and I'm no genetic.
No, he's adopted. He's not my biological brother.
Okay, I got you. Okay, so any other mechanical reasons you can think of? You talk about like the sort of like a mesh. If you've had a hernia repair and they put a mesh in there, that creates extra pressure. What about just like tight fitting clothing, or like a tight belt or something?
Oh
like
yeah,
that?
I'm definitely sure tight belt. A lot of people loosen their belts up after eating a huge meal to relieve some of that pressure. So yeah, definitely. I've written about that in Picture about clothing. Tight shirts, tight belts. I don't think anybody really wears corsets anymore, but they definitely cause problems.
Yeah.
Even though I had to wear one after my hernia surgery, they called it a truss, but it's technically the same thing. But yeah, that could definitely cause problems too as well. No doubt about that.
Yeah, I guess I guess they have to change the branding to get dudes to wear it, because you're like, I'm not wearing a corset, but they're like, no, this is a truss. It's totally fine.
Yeah, it sure looked like a corset to me.
Yeah. So yeah, I don't know how popular that stuff is with women, like traditional corsets, but they do have like shapewear and stuff, which is kind of similar, where there's like undergarments that kind of push everything in. So yeah, that could be not so good.
No.
That's interesting. Yeah, so I talked to a lot of people that have acid reflux because, according to the CDC, it's almost 20% of the population. So that's like 1 in 5 people are going to have some sort of experience some sort of reflux. And that's a lot. And they basically always tell me the same thing. It's like, oh, yeah, well, I just take my Tums, or, I went to the doctor and I got omazaprole or something like that, which is a proton pump inhibitor. And it drives me crazy because they seem to only be looking at the symptoms and not the cause. It's been studied that when you mess up the pH of your stomach, it's going to create more dysbiosis because the acid in the stomach keeps a lot of the bacteria in check, particularly H. pylori, which I think is becoming an epidemic of H. pylori infections.
Oh, I definitely agree with you, Jason. I follow the work of Erin Brockovich a lot. Most people probably remember Erin Brockovich from the Julia Roberts movie that came out in the 90s. But she talks a lot about H. pylori biofilms are really colonizing municipal water supplies in the pipes because they're not completely disinfecting them they're using chloramine, chlorinated ammonia, instead of pure chlorine to try to disinfect the pipes, and it's just not doing as well. H. pylori is able to survive. It's able to produce a lot of biofilm, and it's causing a really bad infection rate in these major cities because they're not using, as much as I don't like chlorine, it's so much easier to, you just run chlorine through activated charcoal and it'll get, the chlorine out. Chloramines are a whole different ballgame of trying to detoxify that from your water. But yeah, it's causing a major, people are going to their sink and filling up a glass of water, and little do they know they could be getting their infection dose of H. pylori, and then they end up having it.
Yeah, it's, we're using a lot of lead in our pipes. And so, they always say, well, lead's really toxic, right? You don't want to get lead into your system. We don't want to be drinking lead. And so what keeps lead from the pipes into leaching into the water so that we drink it? And I've heard some explanations of that, and they say, hey, well, it's a really interesting thing is that the water creates its own film that protects or that I don't know, protects the pipes from leaching into the water. But it's not really the water that's creating the film, right? It's bacteria in the water that create the biofilms.
Yes.
So to some degree, that's kind of useful because it protects the pipes, but then you get the films that build up so much that it starts to impede water flow. And so then they got to send in a chlorine flush. And I think they do it maybe like once or twice a month where they'll just flush everything with chlorine and it'll kill everything off. And then they basically start over again.
Well, they have to. They have to do that every 2 months because if not, it'd just be too much biofilm in the pipes and people get horribly sick. I mean, if they use chlorine, they would have never had that problem. But no, they have to use chloramine instead. And that's why bacteria are able to produce biofilms, is because more bacteria can survive chloramine instead of direct chlorine as a disinfectant.
So why do they use chloramine instead of chlorine? Is it just a cost thing, or?
I think it's because they really haven't really ever given a straight answer for what I've seen. Of why. I think because it has less of a smell, and that way the water's more palatable. That's literally the only thing I could think of what they say. The main reasons why they do it is because when they flush the pipes and you got that really strong chlorine smell, and you go to drink it, you're like, oh, this it smells like a pole, and
Sure.
you're like, I'm not going to drink this. Where the chloramine doesn't have that strong flavor to it. It doesn't have, the chloramine doesn't have that strong smell, that strong chlorine flavor. So I think probably a lot of it is just literally just, I would assume just that. I mean, they say that, I think one last thing is, chlorine forms a lot of byproducts in water too. A lot of, I think it's THM, some acetic acids in the water. And they say chloramine forms less like of these chlorine byproducts. But at the same time, chloramine itself you could easily neutralize a lot of those byproducts in chlorine just using a standard charcoal filter. You can't do that with chloramine. So
Right.
It's silly, but they continue to use it, I guess, because they say it's better, even though it's not for our health, but it is what it is.
So different water systems where you have harder water, it tends to be treated a lot less than if you have softer water. So if you have really soft water, they usually have to add more treatment chemicals to it, and it depends on where your water's coming from. Like if it's coming out of a river that's flowing by, they usually have to treat it pretty hard versus if it's sort of like an underground aquifer, because it runs through all that sand and stuff underground. So it tends to filter out a lot of the bad stuff, a lot of the bacteria and stuff through that sand. And so they don't have to treat it as much. So depending on where you are, you might be getting more or less H. pylori in your water or less chloramine.
Yeah, which I'd actually say, I wish our local water municipality used chlorine instead of chloramines, and I wish they didn't put fluoride in the water, because taking both of those are difficult to get out. But I guess we're going to have a tangent. But yeah, that seems to be one of the biggest sources of H. pylori infection right now, is not so much of going to third world countries. It seems to be from them using chloramines, which is improperly disinfecting the local municipalities of major cities of their drinking water. So, I mean, there's many different ways to get H. pylori. The three main ways seem to be drinking water in the United States, improperly treated water, improperly cleaned vegetables and fruits, and kissing. Kissing someone who has an active H. pylori infection would also transmit it as well.
Yeah. H. pylori is, I'm not really sure if it was natural flora, but it seems like pretty much everybody's got it now. So I doubt that there's anybody who's H. pylori free within the continental United States.
And after time, H. pylori, yeah, you're right. It seemed H. pylori evolved mechanisms for it to survive in humans, over time. And I do agree with you that most of the standard tests for H. pylori, they're not very good. If you go get a stool antigen test, well, H. pylori has many different mechanisms to protect itself from the immune system. So those are fairly inaccurate. Or if you go get an endoscope, well, they could biopsy a place that since H. pylori is transient, they could biopsy a place where the H. pylori currently is not colonized and say you're free. Or you can go get a urea breath test done, and there's a possibility, if you have low stomach acid. I mean, not low stomach acid, low stomach pH. Good amount of stomach acid. The H. pylori is embedded in your stomach, and you'll test negative for that. So the testing methods for H. pylori are very poor at best that we currently have. And there are, like you said, there are many people. I would assume that are walking around with this bacteria who don't know, and not make H. pylori to be like it's a villain. When it is bedded into the mucosal barrier of the stomach, or if you get it as a child instead of an adult, for example, and you do have good normal flora, it can be somewhat beneficial. There are studies of it if it may be actually protecting against cancer. If it's not, there's different strains. Some strains produce have different toxin abilities. You start damaging, the esophageal or the stomach mucosa more or less. VACA A toxins or SIGA A toxins. So there are different strains, and some are worse than others. But it's definitely something that I believe that a lot of people are walking around with, and I think it's one of the main causes of upper gut dysbiosis and most types of reflux.
Yeah, I mean, if you're Th2 dominant, it might not be such a bad thing to have some healthy H. pylori in your system.
As long as it doesn't produce histamine. Some strains do produce histamine.
Yeah. When I think of like the H. pylori, instead of breaking things down into different strains, a lot of times I just look at the environment as a whole, because you have to understand that once bacteria start to colonize, they can behave differently in certain situations. So if you've got just a few and they're running around doing their thing, okay, they're probably not going to have these virulent displays. But if you have a bunch of them and they're all in the same location and they're working together, then they behave quite differently. And that goes back to the dysbiosis factor that we were talking about earlier. So it's not just do you have H. pylori, it's how much H. pylori is in there. And you also have to look at the population of lactobacillus, because they tend to be inversely proportionate. The more lactobacillus that you have in your gut, the less H. pylori that tends to be found, and vice versa. So they tend to compete with each other. And so one of the problems with having a high H. pylori population is that drives down your lactobacillus population, and that's not good at all. Because that's your healthy gut flora, and you talk about bacteria that are protectant, that do a lot of good things for us. Lactobacillus is probably in the top 5 that I can think of that would be in the gut. So the fact that they sort of like war against each other, I don't know if that's the proper term, but when one goes up, the other tends to go down, and that can create problems. So why are we talking so much about H. pylori? Well, H. pylori has been shown to have issues with, it's been shown to cause issues with things like peptic ulcers and with acid reflux, and the population of that has just been shown to
gastritis and stomach cancer too as well. It's been shown to be one of the main causes of gastric cancer, if not one of the main primary causes of gastric cancer, from the endotoxins and inflammation that the bacteria produces, as well as it could be implicated in many quote-unquote autoimmune diseases like multiple sclerosis, Sjogren's syndrome. But yeah, it's definitely something you don't want an overgrowth of.
Yeah, for sure. And yeah, that's interesting that you talk about the autoimmune things, because, like the dietary interventions that we're seeing with like elimination diets and stuff that drive down the populations of H. pylori seem to have a huge benefit. So it might not be, an inherent, like we think of autoimmune system, it's like, oh, my immune system's messing up. Well, maybe it's messing up because it's trying to find something, it's trying to find that bacterial overgrowth to fight, but you can't quite get there. So it ends up damaging other organs or other systems. With MS, it seems to, attack, like the myelin in your axons and stuff like that. So it breaks that down.
Yeah, it seems to be the main 2 triggers for MS, to my knowledge. It seems to be H. pylori and viral reactivation of the herpes viridae viruses. A combination of those. It could be any gram-negative bacteria like Citrobacter or Protospirobellus, but it seems to be H. pylori seems to be one of the biggest ones. And in combination with that viral reactivation seems to be manifests itself in the disease known as MS.
Yeah. So, if somebody has acid reflux, and it's, what would you say? It's like probably to some degree they would have to have some sort of dysbiosis, even if everything else was kind of out of whack too, right? Because they need to have that pressure, that gas pressure.
Yes.
And would you say that H. pylori is probably the bacteria that's most likely to cause that pressure, to release the gases that cause that pressure?
I mean, very much so. I mean, it's either H. pylori, any of those gram-negative bacteria that produce hydrogen or hydrogen sulfide, whether it's H. pylori or Citrobacter or Enterobacter or Protosporobolos or Klebsiella. Any of those, yeah, we'll talk about H. pylori because it seems to be the number one. But like you mentioned earlier, lactobacillus, lactobacillus produces, carbon dioxide. It doesn't produce hydrogen, so it doesn't really bloat. There you go. It also produces GABA for us and lactic acid, and helps to process B12 and acetylcholine. It gives us all these positive things that we need for our body, to function properly. And a lot of people with, like you mentioned, H. pylori overgrowth, it affects the lactobacillus, so they end up, producing less GABA, so they end up having more anxiety because of that. So yeah, it's all within a balance. And so when a person gets H. pylori, the H. pylori starts producing urease, it starts producing ammonia. The body does have a very good way of reducing ammonia through the urea cycle through the liver, but it can become overburdened sometimes. And it can start causing, anxiety and issues in the brain through increased glutamic acid and not enough GABA to reduce it. So, so it causes all these issues. I mean, if we're looking strictly from the reflux potential, it's because H. pylori produces hydrogen. Hydrogen causes more gas, so you have more bloating in the stomach. It also slows down the migrating motor complex, or what drives peristalsis through the stomach and the intestinal tract. So a lot of people suffer from constipation. It slows down gastric emptying, so that the H. pylori has more time to break down proteins and get simple carbohydrates for energy and for replication. So it does all these things to set up so that your lower esophageal sphincter weakens over time from the gas and everything, and you start refluxing, the stomach acid, you start refluxing pepsin, and you actually start refluxing these endotoxins that the H. pylori shed, and the endotoxins within their cell wall itself. And the H. pylori, because when we first ingest H. pylori, it colonizes the mouth, moves down to the esophagus, and it moves down to the stomach, and sometimes the duodenum, and it can affect the liver, the gallbladder, and the pancreas. It doesn't colonize the rest of the small intestine. It doesn't colonize the colon because it can't survive down there. It can't ferment carbohydrates very well. Right. It requires,
it needs oxygen.
It needs oxygen. It needs, it can do protein fermentation, and it can get glucose. So that's the stuff that it would get in this general area that I'm talking about. It's called the upper gut. So it colonizes that, and from there, if it's able to become dysbiotic, where it starts, there's more colonies of it, and it starts out-competing and eliminating a lot of these probiotic bacteria like lactobacillus or peptococcus, or any of those that live in the stomach, it could cause all these issues, increased bloating, weaker lower esophageal sphincter, increased gas, and you start refluxing more than you would normally do, and that starts damaging the esophagus, and it starts competing with Akkermansia and ecophilia, and it starts reducing that, and it just leads into this chronic manifestation of reflux. And then when you go to your doctor and they give you a PPI, that's actually going to make you worse over time. It may help you at first because PPIs ironically do reduce H. pylori. They do have, the medicine itself does have a slight antimicrobial effect on bacteria as well to some degree. And it also will reduce the amount of stomach acid you're refluxing. But over time, the H. pylori will overcome that, and your reflux will get worse than it was previously for most people.
I think if I remember my history correctly, it was the Japanese that kind of figured all of this out, like in the late 80s and early 90s, right?
Talk about for H. pylori?
Right, because like
it was Barry Marshall. He was an Australian microbiologist who gave himself, who no one believed him. They thought he was crazy. He was walking around saying H. pylori is the cause of ulcers, it's the cause of GERD, and everybody's like, no, the cause of ulcers is stress and diet. What are you talking about? And so eventually he concocted a culture of H. pylori, drank it himself, gave him H. pylori, gave himself ulcers, and then treated himself with antibiotics, and he got better and recovered. And then actually took doctors 10 years from there, about 10 to 15 years to about to 2000s for them to start treating ulcers with as H. pylori being the main cause with antibiotics and low acid reducing medications instead of just using acid reducing medications like they did previously in the past. So it took 15 years from that knowledge that was well known to researchers at that time in the mid 80s from Barry Marshall and Australian his Australian research team. It took 15 years for it to be put into clinical practice.
Well, I know I know that the Japanese were one of the first to disambiguate H. pylori from Campylobacter,
right.
because before that they didn't know there was any difference, and they were like, okay, so just basically like we thought people were just getting food poisoning or something. Like, I don't know, they just didn't know the difference. So if you look at the medical research, there really isn't anything on H. pylori. Like they call it like Campylobacter light.
Campylobacter pylori. Yes, that is what Barry Marshall originally taxonomized as Campylobacter pylori. That is, I do agree with you. You're all right.
Yeah. And so like the issue is that like people didn't understand. I think people didn't understand what he was talking about because like there was like they didn't know the difference between the two. But the Japanese were developing treatments for like zinc carnosine, and they were giving it to people in the late 80s and successfully treating people. And they've been doing this for over a generation now, successfully treating people with this method. And the West just hasn't caught on yet.
No, you are right. I agree with you, Jason, that it's crazy.
I mean, and zinc carnosine is not like this woo-woo treatment, I mean, it's not like, oh yeah, we've found these like herbs from this temple and whatever, in Mount Fuji. Like, no, I mean, it's like an industrial synthesized compound. It's, it's not, it's just a chelate of zinc that they made that's been shown to really have a damaging effect on those bacterial colonies, breaking down the biofilms and causing a lot of havoc in the way they culture.
Reducing inflammation of the stomach. I mean, zinc carnosine, I took it myself for years before. And that's one thing I'll talk about on this podcast was I never really thought I had silent reflux, but I never really thought I had H. pylori. You, Jason, always told me that it was H. pylori, and I never believed you because every test I'd ever taken was negative. And I got to the point where I was stable. I still had silent reflux off and on. And I thought a lot of it was because I had permanently had to live with it because of my hernia mesh. And I thought it was structural, but I was wrong. I took a H. pylori virulent stool profile test, and I showed some of the antibodies for SIGA A. They were off the charts. And I said, you know what? Jason's been telling me for a long time that's probably H. pylori. And so I started doing research in H. pylori. That's when I found out a lot of the tests are inaccurate. And I actually went and tackled it. I started taking dilibidine and sticking with it, and suberberine and masticum, and you make sure I'm getting a lot of sun for vitamin D. And lo and behold, I got over my silent reflux, and it was because of you. I mean, I'm sorry that I doubted you for so long, until I did the research and actually did the legwork and looked, and you were right.
Are you sure that was me? I don't remember any of this.
No, that was you. That was you. Yes, it was you.
Okay, I'll take your word for it.
But you kept telling me it was H. pylori every time I go to the doctor, and that all my symptoms, and I kept saying, nah, all my tests are come back negative, it was you.
Well,
you're right.
Look, there's a lot of things, just as far as being able to diagnose H. pylori, it's very difficult. I mean, it's like those allergy scratch tests. I mean, it's just not going to be effective, and yet you still use them because that's what the insurance companies require to begin treatment. And so for H. pylori, it has an endotoxin release, so it releases compounds that affect our expression of TRN1, and it has an effect on our immune system. So it's kind of tricky because it's able to trick our immune system into thinking that it's not there. And you're very fortunate, actually, that you had that stool sample with the elevated immunomarkers, because a lot of people don't even have that. And I think it's because you were able to decrease the pH of your stomach. I mean, you were taking other supplements too, so that you would have, a healthy gastric fluids and stuff. And for people that aren't doing that, and especially for people who are on any sort of acid reduction protocol, like a proton pump inhibitor, or just any like calcium carbonate or anything like that, baking soda, even just whatever they're taking, it makes that situation worse. So it's just really hard. And you were talking earlier about biopsy, which is usually it's usually like the only way you're going to find it is if you happen to brush against where it's colonizing. But the issue is when H. pylori colonizes, it creates a biofilm matrix, and they're able to live within that. They create this protein municipal matrix, and they can live on the inner side of it and never ever have to go on the outside. And the way it's developed is that foodstuffs can go back and forth between this matrix, and they don't ever have to come out. And it sort of protects them against our immune system. It protects them against stomach acid and everything. And that organisms, it's something that they do very well is create biofilm. And the more of them there are, the more complex structures that they can create. And, it's like a hive of them. So you go in there and try to swab that area, and you're just swabbing the outside of the biofilm. You're not actually getting down to where they are. And the more invasive samples where you actually like pull a piece of the epithelial lining, that should be able to do the trick if there's a colony there. But they don't like to do that because it's invasive, And so a lot of times, with that kind of stuff, instead of you just look at everything that's going on. You look at, like, okay, you wake up in the morning and you got a scratchy throat, which indicates that you could have been refluxing all night long. You have like sinus issues in the morning too, because they're getting up into the sinus cavity, and you get this, like, no matter how much you brush your teeth, you always end up with this film on the outside of your teeth. And if that's happened, that's really bad, because it's shown, the gum inflammation that can be caused by H. pylori has been shown to, those endotoxins get all the way down into the heart. And there's been big correlation between your gum health and heart disease. And so it's not just local to reflux. It has, a lot of other implications too. So, I'm kind of on a mission to try to help people understand how this stuff works a little bit better. I think that it's one of the things that we kind of have wrong as a whole, and our treatment of the various types of reflux. And just these acid reduction protocols is, they work temporarily, but in the long run, you're actually doing more damage than you're doing good for yourself. And so I'm just trying to reach as many people as I can, and trying to help them out, because it's something that, once you start getting on that imazapril, that proton pump inhibitor, it's really hard to get off. It's not fun at all, to get off of that, have to start creating dealing with that acid coming back up, and, just the die off from when some of the H. pylori start dying off again, start to control their numbers. That's not fun either.
Or what about, Jason? What about the people that get tricked, and I will say tricked, into getting anti-reflux surgeries, like a nice and fun ablation, or link surgery, and it doesn't correct their underlying problem, like H. pylori dysbiosis beforehand. And yeah, their symptoms do get better a little bit initially from the LES being reinforced, and from more oxygen and antibiotics taken used from the surgery too, as well, from the surgery itself. And eventually, they end up having problems. I mean, I have a friend who sends me all these Facebook from this nice and fun ablation group, or this reflux surgery group, should I say, of these people saying, how bad the surgery is, a couple of weeks to a couple of months later. And I just have like thousands of these saved up. And I was thinking about taking like a lot of them and just doing a blog on nice and fun ablation, and just putting, posting like 100 of these comments, and just at the very end of the blog, just writing, "Don't do it," because it doesn't fix the underlying issue.
Mm-hmm.
And so you end up physically modifying your body to try to escape from reflux. And in the end, it ends up causing more problems for most people than they initially had beforehand.
I'm just going to make this sort of blanket statement that everything is pretty individual and that you should definitely be working with a doctor. But for me, I've never seen anybody that's going to benefit from a PPI with these reflux surgeries. I can't see, if you understand the cause and you understand what's going on, it's really hard to say like how this could ever help anybody in the long run.
Yeah.
And just getting people to understand the mechanics, like what's going on here. And then once you figure out what's actually causing the reflux, you can develop a treatment protocol that is going to actually help people to where, because the goal is to be able to get off of medications, not stay on them for the rest of your life. And so, there's some dietary interventions too, like table sugar. H. pylori seems to really love sucrose or table sugar.
Mm-hmm.
And
and a supplemental glutamine.
Yeah. And unfortunately, people with LES damage seem to benefit from that glutamine protocol. But you got to kill off the H. pylori first before you start rebuilding it, because, other things like there's some habitual things that can help, like H. pylori stimulate the vagus nerve through the upregulation of TRN1. And basically, that's just a fancy way of saying that kind of makes you more high strung a little bit, kind of makes you more type A. And what that does is it makes you more prone to what's called air swallowing. And so it's like, I guess, like a nervous tick. You just start swallowing air, and that helps to get oxygen down into the stomach. And it seems to, it thrives a lot better in an oxygenated state rather than sort of that fermentation state where you don't have the oxygen present. So just to be mindful of your habits and make sure that you're not swallowing air and taking the time to breathe and relax. Some people
don't use straws.
Right. Yeah. And it's tough because, people start to get really high strung, and, just if you can just get people to just calm down and just breathe, maybe start like a mindfulness practice or listen to music, or just being aware, listening a little bit more and just being more aware of what you're doing. And so that you'll end up swallowing less air and you'll be more relaxed, and that'll end up helping you a lot too.
Supplement with magnesium, which may help calm the vagus nerve, as well as help reduce any glutamate excitability from the ammonia producing of H. pylori. Yeah, why don't we talk about some supplements that people could take, some supplement recommendations. Of course, everybody run it through your healthcare practitioners. But why don't we talk about some supplements that people could take that might help them with reflux, or some tips that they could do? We continue talking about tips they could do to help with that.
Right. Well, I'll start with my favorite one, which is D-limonene. And I'm kind of disappointed because the Jaro D-limonene is no longer on Amazon. So I have to go to another site to order it, so I don't get my Prime shipping and all that stuff. But I'll still recommend it. The D-limonene seems to really do a good job of not only killing off the H. pylori, but it coats. It's a terpene. It's not actually an oil. People call it like orange peel oil or whatever. It's not actually an oil. It's a terpene, and it floats on top of the surface. It floats on top of everything in your stomach. So when you do reflux, it kind of coats everything going up, so that it protects some of the tissues. And so it helps you in two different ways. It helps you by controlling the population of H. pylori, and it also helps you by coating everything so that you don't get damage from the pepsin in the bile, and hopefully no bile, but in the stomach acid.
And it also increases vasoactive intestinal peptide, which helps with motility of the intestines, helps to secrete bicarbonate by the pancreas, stimulates proper bile, and helps to make sure your stomach's got proper acid by regulating pepsinogen production and gastrin production. VIP is also anti-inflammatory, and it also, D-limonene seems to increase stage 2 liver detoxification and increases cellular glutathione production when it's needed, which will help you detoxify some of those endotoxins that are laying around from H. pylori. And one of the last things about D-limonene is it seems to really don't know the mechanism of action, but it seems to activate the GABA receptors within the brain. So it seems to give some people prevent anxiety, give people a sense of calmness
Yeah,
as well.
that's why I like to take it at night
Yep,
before bed.
that's what I recommend.
And not just because of the calmness, but because when I'm going to be sleeping, I'm going to be lying down, not standing up. And so it gives me more of a protective effect too.
Yeah, I mean, I love D-limonene. I know you're a huge supporter of it. Now, some people, there are a few people who are able to tolerate it, and it can be irritating to the esophagus in some people, but it's rare. I know a lot of people who supplement it with great success. And there's a good blog of D-limonene. I'm going to link it in the show notes. Fix Your Gut that I wrote. But yeah, I like D-limonene.
Yeah.
I've recommended it to a lot of people with upper gut dysbiosis. We talked about zinc carnosine earlier. I'm a huge fan of zinc carnosine. It's what helped keep my silent reflux somewhat in check when I first started taking it many years ago. I think without it, I probably would probably never recovered. And I can't. And I wrote an excellent blog about it and Fix Your Gut too as well. And it's actually a prescription drug in Japan. It's not like Jason said. It's not some like supplement herb formulation that someone made or anything. It's an actual prescription drug in Japan. So it is backed up by a lot of research by the Japanese. And it's used for upper gut dysbiosis.
Yeah.
I'm also you should also work to reacidifying your stomach. Short term options like betaine HCl or apple cider vinegar. Diluted apple cider vinegar and water or mix in with your vegetables is a good idea. Long term, maybe taking some digestive bitters. I recommend Urban Moonshine alcohol-free apple cider vinegar bitters. Might be a good way to help lower your stomach pH and reacidify your stomach. And also, I guess, two quick things is making sure when you eat during the daytime, because per circadian rhythm, that is when we digest our food mainly, is during the day when our motility and our MMC is working at its height. So you don't want to eat usually after 6 p.m., 6 or 7 p.m. in the evening. And as well as you want to try to eat 3 meals as much as you can to keep from interruption of the MMC and everything. Try not to snack as much as you can. And get sunlight, within reason, because, endogenous production of vitamin D will help properly regulate your immune system and serotonin exposure.
Yeah, and especially in the morning, you need to get sunlight because our digestion is influenced by circadian rhythm. And, there's a lot of things going on other than just, chemical compounds. Well, I mean, I guess everything works through chemical compounds too, but when you get that blue light, it hits your retinas in the morning, it hits your skin, that tells your body that it's time to be awake. And you can start eating and digesting food and all that stuff, and then at night you want to stay away from blue light, and you want to only be around red light if you can, and that will kind of slow things down for you, and you definitely don't want to eat during that time, and that will help prevent dysbiosis. It'll keep things moving the way they're supposed to, and it'll keep you healthier. It'll keep your digestive tract healthier. It seems like a weird thing that like the amount of light that you're exposed to is going to affect your digestion, but it really has a significant impact on the way our genes are expressed and the way the bacteria communicate as well, because the bacteria in our guts are being influenced by melatonin, and they produce a lot of it as well. So, and a lot of these circadian hormones are influence, even cortisol and adenosine, like a lot of these sort of regulating hormones play a role in how our bacteria behave. And, just having good circadian rhythm, getting good sleep, that's going to really help things if you're having trouble.
Sleep's also important for recovery, and melatonin is very important for the digestive system as well. It's a very potent anti-inflammatory agent, so circadian rhythm is one of the most important things anybody could do for their health almost for free. As long as you don't work third shift, if you do, I feel bad for you. But I mean, everybody else, it's something that you could easily do. It doesn't cost you anything. Getting sun doesn't cost you anything either. Those things you could do right now. Reduce the amount of sugar you're taking in, like Jason had recommended. All those things are things you can do to help your reflux now without costing you a penny.
All right. Well, it's been over an hour, so we should probably wrap up, and we'll dig into some other topics later on. We might do a podcast specifically on H. pylori or something else we talked about a lot today too. But I hope that everybody has at least a better idea now about what causes acid reflux, some of the the mechanical reasons and the postural reasons, and definitely the microbiome and how it plays a role. And acid reflux is not caused by too much acid. I just want everybody to go away with that idea so that when they work with their doctor for a treatment protocol, that they're on the same page. I guess they're on a page that's taken from the book of reality and not from, I don't know where they're getting this other stuff from. But anyway, so have a good one, everybody. Stay healthy, and we'll see you next time.
Goodbye.